Hello, my name's Mary Paulson-Ellis and I'm really delighted to have been asked by Gateshead Libraries to record this little video for you about my second novel, The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing. So I'm a writer and I live in Edinburgh, and which is also where my novels are set. I've published two books, the first of which was a novel called The Other Mrs. Walker. There she is. And the second is The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing, as I mentioned. Both of my novels deal in what I call the territory of the dead. And that is the world of people who die with no apparent next of kin. So I'm very interested in who looks after you if you end up in that situation. And Mrs. Walker is all about a character called Margaret Penny, who gets a job working for the Office for Lost People and has to look after an old lady who's been found dead in a flat in Edinburgh on her own, no paperwork or anything that explains who she is really. And so Margaret Penny has to go on a sort of a journey to find the paperwork and that will establish exactly who Mrs. Walker is, and will get to the point where Margaret Penny can organise her funeral. In some ways, the novels are detective stories. They have a mystery at their heart that has to be solved, and in this way, they kind of part of the crime genre. Really, they always start with a dead body, although not necessarily a suspicious one. We have police officers involved, and mortuaries, and the Crown Office, and really, it's about, can you solve the puzzle as the reader, and will my main character solve the puzzle of who is the dead person and what has happened to them. So that leads me to the second element of my books, which is that once I started writing them, I realised that I became very interested in who was the person who had died. And I wanted to find a way to illuminate that for the reader. And so I started to write a historical narrative, which went back into the past of the person who had died and gave the reader a flavour, really, of who they were and what had maybe brought them to the end point in their life. So both my books have sort of dual narratives dealing in this kind of territory. So once I'd finished writing The Other Mrs. Walker, which is all about women and girls, I wanted to write a novel that dealt in the same territory but was about men and boys. And I also wanted to write about heir hunters. So for those of you who don't know, an heir hunter is somebody who pursues the estate of a person who's died without a will, and also with no obvious next of kin or anyone to pass the estate on to. I think this is such an interesting subject matter, legacy and inheritance, and particularly if there's money involved. Some of you might have come across the television series BBC Heir Hunters, and that gives you a really lovely insight into the sort of odd and strange cases that these individuals and firms come across. So basically, I decided to create an heir hunter for my second novel. His name is Solomon Farthing, and he is someone who basically looks at the estates of someone who's died without a will and tries to track down a living relative who he can then persuade to sign with him so that he could administer the estate of the deceased person in return for a slice of the cash, which is what it's all about. Now, my heir hunter is in his 60s. He's an old-style heir hunter. He used to do his job by dipping into the actual ledgers, the archives, the births, marriages and deaths, whereas, of course, modern heir hunting is all about digital archives and Ancestry.com and everything you can find online these days, which is an amazing resource. So he's a little bit out of step with the modern world, let's put it like that. He's a bit of a ducker and a diver as well, I think that's fair to say. When I did my research for The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing, I met a couple of heir hunters who told me all sorts of tales. And what's interesting about it is that it's an unregulated industry. So at the one end, you've got sort of very respectable firms and individuals who work for lawyers and who work for solicitors and who do very good work. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are really scam artists, I would say, at the worst end of the market. So Solomon Farthing, I think it's fair to say, is on the sort of slightly more disreputable end of the market, and he's also got a bit of a gambling problem. So he owes money left, right, and centre all over Edinburgh. And he at the beginning of the book, he has been casing the joint of an empty property that has been left by someone who's died with no apparent next of kin. And he's gone in there, he's sort of broken into it in an attempt to see whether it's worth pursuing this case before any of the other heir hunters pile in. And he gets caught by the police, and he gets bailed out by DCI Franklin because he once did her a favour, and now she's going to do a favour for him. And the favour she does for him is she gives him the heads up on the case of an old soldier who's died alone in a nursing home in Edinburgh, and there's a question about something that he's left behind. So I'll read you a little snippet that gives you a flavour of Solomon getting his case that he hopes is going to solve all his problems. The dead man's name was Thomas Methven. At least that was what DCI Franklin said. But Solomon wondered how long that name would stick, given the blank slate of their surroundings. A bed, a wardrobe, a chair, not even an antimacassar. Nothing to indicate that a life had taken place here, let alone a death. How old? He asked. 95, maybe 96, said the DCI. No one's quite sure. His wife died 20 years or so ago. No children that we're aware of. Siblings? Only child. Solomon couldn't resist a small smile at the idea of a big space all around the dead man on whatever family tree might grow from his demise. What about his next of kin, he said. Have they been informed? Oh, there aren't any, said the DCI, at least none that anyone knows about. That's where you come in. That and the money, of course. 50,000 in used notes. That was what it amounted to, the treasure Thomas Methven had left behind. Sewn inside his burial suit, said the DCI. What? Solomon had come across lots of odd things in his career as an heir hunter, but he'd never heard of that before. Money for a funeral worn like a second skin. The undertaker found it when she came to dress him, said DCI Franklin. Called the home, they called us. Said it was about 50,000, give or take. Despite the early morning hour, Solomon felt a sudden tingle inside at the prospect of this case. 50,000 in cash, 20% of which would start to sort out his problem very nicely indeed. Thank you very much. Don't suppose he left any instructions about what to do with it, he asked. Where there was a will, there was a way, but not for an heir hunter. A will was the last thing Solomon wanted to stumble across. Not that we can find, said the DCI. No idea where the money came from or where it should go. The home thought he was an indigent. They were about to call Margaret Penny of the Office for Lost People and get them to arrange the cremation when I stepped in. 50,000 up in smoke, thought Solomon, saved by the DCI to live another day. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. So that's Solomon getting his case, and I was reading from the paperback edition of the book, which just came out in April this year. And really what happens is he goes on a quest through various ins and outs to try and find a living relative of the old Thomas Methven, who's an old soldier. And to do that, he goes to the National Library in Edinburgh, he goes to the Records Office in Edinburgh, and he also finds his way down to Northumberland, to Alnwick Castle and the Fusiliers Museum there, and eventually he ends up at what he calls the Mothership, which is the National Archive at Kew. And all the way along on his sort of twists and turns of the journey, he keeps bumping up against things that relate to his own grandfather, Godfrey Farthing, and also a group of men who were soldiers at the very end of the First World War. And that brings me to the second half of the book, which is the historical narrative. And when I was setting out to write the book, I knew I wanted to talk about heir hunters, but I didn't know what the historical narrative would be. All I knew was I had a scenario in my mind, which was a group of men standing around with guns in their hands, rifles in their hands, and a man dead at their feet. And the question was who had shot whom and why. And quite quickly I realised that this was a group of soldiers, that they were in 1918, that it was November, that the end of the war was coming and that they knew that it was coming, but they didn't know exactly when. Was it going to be days? Was it going to be weeks? Was it going to be months? And these were a group of men, about 10 of them, who had been separated from the rest of their company. And they were waiting in a sort of farmhouse billet for their orders to arrive. And the orders could be to attack, or the end of the war could come. So it was a question of which was going to arrive first. And I started to understand that while they were waiting, these men had to fill the time somehow. And what they did was they started to gamble and play games. And gambling, of course, was absolutely rife in wartime, even though officially it was illegal, but everybody did it, and the captains and the senior officers just turned a blind eye, and sometimes the senior officers did it themselves. But this group of men, they gamble, they play games, games of chicken, games of cards, games of dice, and really it's a question of what happens as a result of all the games that they play that leads us to the moment of them standing with a dead man at their feet. So what I'll do is I'll read to you from the very beginning of the book, which gives you that little scenario that I just described. So this is the beginning. In the end there was one, but there should have been two. Dead men laid out amongst the walnut shells, skin already blue. A great rose bloomed over the dead man's heart, there on his second best shirt, bright amongst the decay. Those who were left looked away, thinking of the one who should have been there, but was not, lungs like wings of ice, holding him to the bottom of a river, where none of them would have to follow now. Above them, birds perched silent amongst the branches. The sky hung grey on the horizon. It was morning. Dawn would be here soon. In the end they drew lots to decide who would choose first, a wishbone, a tanner, a reel of pink cotton, before the rest came rummaging too, into breast pockets and hip pockets, and pockets tucked away by the kidneys and the groin. The dead man lay unprotesting as the men dipped their hands in. Everything was sticky. They wiped their palms on damp khaki wool and fingered the rest of the treasure, 2 dice, that piece of green ribbon, a canvas pocketbook filled with needles and pins. They all smelled it, cordite, and the bullet that was inside the dead man now. So that's a little taster of my men in 1918 waiting for the war to end. And really the book is a question of how what has happened between these men ripples through into the present day and washes up on the shores of Solomon Farthing, the air hunter, trying to understand and find a living relative for this old soldier who has died. And what he discovers quite quickly is that the captain of this group of men in the past is his own grandfather, Captain Godfrey Farthing. So I won't say any more about it. You'll have to get hold of a copy of the book to read it and understand how the two are connected. But I think it's fair to say that what Solomon discovers is that it's not so much where the money that Thomas Methven leaves should go to, but where it came from in the first place. And also, by the end, he understands that in order to pay the debts of the present, you have to settle those of the past first. So I really hope that you can get hold of a copy of The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing, and that if you do, you enjoy it. Thank you very much. Goodbye.